Without the knowledge of the authorities, people came up with a host of offensive nicknames for Louis, but he didn't lose heart. He named himself the Sun King, such a modest man. Not only that, but he also ordered others to address him in this way, doing to the French what Caesar Octavian had once done to the Romans, forcing them to acknowledge his divinity. But this deity of the mid-17th century was hardly one to be equated with the light of the sun, except perhaps through the lens of dozens of different perversions, bonds, and broken families. In essence, this ruler, born in September 1638, was considered king from the age of 4. It so happened that in the first half of 1643, France found itself in a difficult situation. Louis XIII died, and Philip was still a tiny infant, a newborn. Instead of one specific regent, even before our hero's father passed away, a whole council of regency was established, with the dying monarch requesting that his wife and brother not be included, as he didn't trust them. And so it came to pass that until the future Sun King came of age, the country fell into the hands of a gang led by the churchmen Mazarin and Henri VII de Condé, a member of the royal family. The future Cardinal Richelieu would form his own guard to avoid being subordinate to this powerful clan. The infighting, which involved politicians and military leaders from all over Europe, began as early as 1643. The Queen Mother, understanding who was the main player in the Regency Council, made Mazarin the best friend of the new ruler of France, who was raised by him. France, having participated in the 30 Years' War and several other wars of conquest, became richer than ever before. It's worth remembering that it already had several colonies, and Apollo turned out to be the richest man in Europe. Previously, kings were usually a little poorer than some of the hereditary nobility. In the midst of this situation, the young lover of Apollo's dance parties, thanks to which he later chose his bright nickname, made Versailles what we know it to be today. A breakthrough in architecture, garden and park art, and interior design. I'm not mistaken, the king indulged in luxury from a young age. Politics, religion, diplomacy, and war were beyond his grasp at that age. These were the domain of warring clans, each of which had its own armed forces. Where do you think the well-known expression from Dumas' novel, "The Musketeers of the King and the Guards of the Cardinal," came from? The path to independent power began after the famous aristocratic Fronde Rebellion, when Louis finally gained enough experience to accumulate all the functions of governing the country in his hands. He realized that no one in the country could be trusted. The 17-year-old dandy also demonstrated his firmness in the mid-1650s, when he became convinced that the common people could be incited, as evidenced by the official coronation in 1654, of course in the Roman cathedral. He began to establish his own laws and regulations, the ordinances and statutes, the main ones being 3. First, everything within France, as well as the colonies, became the exclusive property of the crown. Moreover, state positions were no longer given to feudal lords, but to devoted commoners. Second, the church lost the influence it had before. Third, at court, one had to behave in a certain way, and a violation of this code was punished severely. Meanwhile, Versailles already had 100 rooms and 250,000 trees, a canal, a waterfall, a kilometer of river embankment, green labyrinths of trimmed bushes, and a lot of gold and Venetian mirrors. Exotic animals were often displayed here. Versailles was a place of pleasure, and some of the first norms of its own composition were created here. We will talk about point number 3 of Louis XIV's fierce lawmaking activity. When ladies and gentlemen found themselves at his court, they ceased to belong to themselves. Remember his motto, "The state, it is me." During the peak of his power, he had 5,000 courtiers. One had to address the king in the third person, "His Majesty, Sir," or King. One had to pay homage even to the king's portrait. Without his permission, no one opened their mouth. One should never stand with their back to the king, and when leaving the king, one had to walk backward, bowing. As for the behavior among themselves, the first to greet was the dignitary of higher rank. A nod was enough. But the vis-a-vis had to either sit in a curtsy, if it was a lady, or bow, if it was a gentleman. Touching a woman without her consent was considered taboo. There were circumstances under which one person did not know the rank of another, and in such cases, monsieur and madame were used. Of course, very young ladies were addressed as Mademoiselle. During gambling and group entertainment with the king, even at the most delicate moment, one could not say anything until asked. The king was the lawmaker of fashion in all spheres. Wigs, stockings, lace, patches, brooches, and huge feathers on equally huge hats. If you think I'm starting to talk about women's accessories, even high-ranking male subjects had to wear all this to finally return the country to the rank of a fashion trendsetter, a title it had lost immediately after the 30 Years' War. Denmark tried to take this title from France. One had to have a lot of powder and rouge on one's face. The sovereign of the Sun period spent half his life learning to dance, forcing the entire court to watch how great he was at it, and even insulting the audience. He had to show himself perfectly at balls, and perfume was a special song. Versailles was probably the largest consumer of perfumes, colognes, and all kinds of fragrances and spices made from plant and animal materials from all over the world. At this time, the rest of the country suffered from poverty. For example, the famine of 1709 took the lives of 600,000 people. If Louis was fascinated by some fresh female image, he didn't hesitate to make someone a cuckold, especially if this image was already someone's wife, or even worse, the king's own half. Only Maria Theresa of Habsburg managed to become the wife of the Sun King, but he had a whole staff of temporary mistresses and permanent favorites, and he replenished it depending on his current preferences. The king could like anyone he saw, and then he would ask special people to do everything to get her into his bed or for regular 12-hour meetings. Once young, he himself was a soloist. It is known that the mentioned king rummaged through his mistresses, and few of them became the favorites of the despot by their own will. Each of them represented how good it was in Versailles, a pervert among the dirty ones, the image of something super bright and super new. The fact that some of Louis XIV's secrets turned out to be dirty, not only in a figurative sense, was known to the courtiers of Versailles, who, despite being the most fashionable in the world, easily went to the toilet in vases on the stairs. And the sun itself sat on the throne with a hole, and the courtiers had to line up according to their ranks. The surgeon was closer to the anus, studying the king's health. In Muscovy and the more eastern states, the palace complex was rarely mentioned without the adjective stinking. As for the park area, liquid and solid waste was thrown out of the luxurious windows of rooms, halls, and galleries right there, not to mention that people urinated in the labyrinths. After the plague of the 10th century, Europeans, even aristocrats and people of royal blood, bathed no more than once a week. It was believed that water, like air, quickly carried the plague. It was a different matter with enemas or erotic pleasures in strange structures, resembling both a swimming pool and a bath. In Versailles, cleanliness and hygiene were reduced to the aroma from the mouth and feet and to the ideal cleanliness of clothing. The last days of the French sun, the man who ruled his country for 72 years, longer than anyone else in history, died in 1715, surrounded by a huge number of courtiers for several days, half of whom hated him because he had handed over the reins of government to two bastards of his favorite mistress, Madame de Montespan, who at that time bore the titles of Duke of Maine and Count of Toulouse. By the way, he had 6 children from his wife and 16 from his mistresses. As for the legitimate sons, by the time of his death, none of the princes had survived. A dynastic crisis could have occurred, but the anointed one died of gangrene of one of his lower limbs. He developed gout, and the surgeon began to cut off his leg, but the patient died after several incisions. If, in the East, people hinting at a tedious and meaningless ritual say Chinese ceremony, in Europe, it is customary to say, as at the court of Louis XIV. This French king invented a particularly complex court etiquette, which in terms of cumbersome courtesy even surpassed the customs of the developed Middle Ages. At the same time, he flagrantly violated ordinary human rules, those connected with biblical traditions, and did so from an early age. This monarch maniac had quite a lot of victims.